next preparation is the chamomile preparation. I did not bring chamomile blossoms. Somebody might have some chamomile tea around. Anyway, you can look at both the yarrow and the chamomile preparations and see that they have gone through some sort of a transformation. It's pretty hard to identify them as the chamomile blossoms anymore. They're humus-like, colloidal-like. If you rub them between your fingers, you will get a smear. And you don't want to use a preparation where you can still clearly identify that it came from yarrow, although it's a little harder to break down on the yarrow, or chamomile. You don't want to be, this is a transformed substance. And it is a carrier of forces. We have 502, we have 503. The next preparation, and I have a sample here of freshly harvested stinging nettle. It may still sting and it may not. I can't answer that. I'm not usually bothered by it. It's very good to roll in a bed of stinging nettle if you have arthritis. Here's the finished preparation. It'd be pretty hard to distinguish the stinging nettle. It's plant. The monks in the medieval ages used to practice something called flagellation, where they would whip themselves. I'm told that the main thing they used to do that whipping was stinging nettle. So they were punishing themselves heartily for their sins. Since we don't sin anymore in our present day and age, we don't have to worry about that. All right, stinging nettle is simply buried in the earth, but it should be surrounded by peat moss. It's pretty hard to recover, and the best way to do it is to put it in a clay tile or maybe a clay flower pot and sort of shelter it from the surrounding soil with a layer of peat moss around it. And it transforms from the green plant you saw. We harvest it when it's in flower. That's not quite in flower yet, it's about to. The sample passed around. Buried in the earth so that it spends the winter in the earth and through the following summer. In biodynamic practice, a lot of people harvest it in June and they unearth it in the following June. That does not allow it to spend the following summer in the earth. If you make a second cutting of nettle in August or September and bury that so that it spends the winter and through the following summer, that gives you about a year, a little bit more. But if you harvest in June, you really need to make it, allow it to stay in the soil at least until September, the end of September. Usually Michaelmas, which is the 29th of September, I believe. So that's the nettle, and its effect or result is that it stimulates soil health, providing plants with the individual nutrition components needed. It enlivens the soil. If you've used some of these preparations as part of a farm individuality and compare it to the human being, the yarrow can be associated with the bladder and the lungs because in the embryo they come from the same basic cells: bladder, kidneys, and lungs. The chamomile is associated with the digestive system and the intestinal tract. The stinging nettle is associated with the heart. And the stinging nettle was very important. This is the only plant that Steiner suggested could not be easily substituted for. So if you make this preparation, you want to get stinging nettle. If you want to experiment with something else for yarrow or chamomile, go to it, but not with stinging nettle. Yes, sir.
So these are to be made and then applied to the compost. They're made and then applied to the compost.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So we got a year. If we started now, it'd take us a year and some change.
Yes, that's why if you want to get started earlier, you come to someone like me or maybe JPI or fellow in Colorado or whatever. Sir?
Does it matter at what stage you apply it, the stage of making your compost?
Aaron Fried Pfeiffer, who brought biodynamics to this country in 1938, maybe even before, did a lot of work with compost. He wrote Compost Manufacturer's Manual, which did not get widely published and is long since out of print. He suggested that the compost preparations be placed in the compost pile as early in the process as possible. When you're first building the pile, in fact, one technique for applying is when you get the pile halfway up, you just place the preparations in their appropriate spot in the pile and then put the rest of the material on top of it for composting. Okay, let's keep on going. Next preparation is the oak bark preparation. This is the preparation. And I had someone else harvest oak bark for me. The desired oak bark is white oak. You can also use, I think this is chestnut oak. Somebody correct me as it goes around if that's not right. Rounded points. This is what she harvested. It's red oak, I think, and you can use it. It's more difficult to harvest from the tree. You just scrape the outer bark. Red oak is a second or third choice. You want the white oak, which grows in this part of the country very nicely. Certainly in my part of the Appalachian chain, we're 6 miles. The farm in Woolwine is 6 miles from the Blue Ridge Parkway. We're pretty close to the Blue Ridge Parkway here too. So the oak bark is very helpful in deterring plant diseases. If you get your squash or your tomato blight or whatever, you could have prevented it by not only applying the usual preparations, but specifically the oak bark preparation. I will give you a regimen for tomatoes, I hope, and prevention of tomato blight. Now, the next preparation, we know dandelion. I seem to have only one sample bag here. Dandelion blossoms. Oh, the oak bark, this is what gets a lot of people in biodynamics. It's placed in the skull of a domestic animal, is the way Steiner described it. And if you're a vegan, I may offend your sensitivities somewhat, but the skull wants to be fresh. My view is that the actual sheath is the meninges lining within the brain cavity, but you can't remove that easily. And so, skull of a domestic animal. That's usually a cow, cattle, bovine, or sheep, sometimes goat, rarely horse. We don't harvest horses much for meat in this country. They do in France. And pig. Pig is very difficult to work with because the slaughterhouse usually splits the skull and you have to kind of bind it back together. I also failed to mention the sheath that is used for the dandelion. That's the peritoneum or mesentery of the cow. This is the membrane that holds all the organs in the abdominal cavity. Or the lining that holds all the intestines together in one piece. You have to be pretty careful when you're making that preparation that you get the blossoms placed on the inside of the peritoneal sheath, the sheath that holds the organs in. If it's a sheath, the peritoneal tissue from inside the cavity, you don't have to worry about it, including that which holds the intestines together. It's easier to work with the the peritoneum, and we have a couple of cooperating slaughterhouses that we get the tissue from, and it's very powerful in bringing cosmic forces into the compost and ultimately into your soils when you apply the compost, either to your garden or to your farm, as the case may be. Okay, last of the 6 compost preparations is valerian. I didn't bring any plants. I don't know whether they have some growing around here. I didn't spot any. Yeah, you can open it and smell it. It's fermented blossoms, fermented juice of the blossoms of the valerian plant when it's in flower. So these 6 preparations are placed in a compost pile. It transforms the substance, whatever material, be it manure or kitchen waste or whatever, it will change it into a fine humusy substance that you can spread on your garden or spread on your pasture, depending. We have a couple of Windrow composts that were made, and they're at least as big as from here to the end of that table where the sprayers are standing. So in that big a pile, we might need two sets of compost preparations. But a little bit goes a long way. How it does it, we truly don't know. We might have people explaining things that will tell you how it's done, but they're lying, and I'm not going to lie to you. We really don't know how these things are working. They are working in dimensions and levels that we have mostly not directly perceived ourselves. And we talk about cosmos and even spiritual dimensions, and this is a book, What is Biodynamics? A Way to Heal the Earth, or Heal and Revitalize the Earth. It's mostly Steiner's lectures, but I wrote a 40-some page introduction that was my attempt to address some of the spiritual realities behind these preparations. Now, this is my interpretation and speculation, or whatever you want to call it, but I was aiming it towards some people who, within a Steinerian movement called anthroposophy, who seem to equate both organic and biodynamics as essentially the same thing. And to my way of thinking, they are not. And this was my effort to tell the anthroposophical audience that there's a whole lot more of these things than we realize. And these preparations are carriers of forces beyond our present understanding, and what accomplishes the job of composting or transforming soil into good humus or growing plants of sturdy nature, upright. What does the job is the forces, not the substance of the preparations. So the key thing is we're dealing with forces. We haven't yet learned to understand them. I certainly haven't. I've made a valiant effort. This is one of my efforts. Another effort is something as simple as this. Pull up lamb's quarter from your biodynamic garden, and you'll have the root looking like the plant in the top. Pull it up from your neighbor's non-biodynamic garden, and you'll have something like the following. So if someone says they're doing biodynamics, it's a quick test to go into their garden and pull up a few weeds and see what they look like. Of course, if they have no weeds in their garden, you're out of luck. But I think most people, you can find a weed here and there, even if they try hard. Okay. That is an introduction to the preparations. Does anybody have any specific questions about the 9 of them? My insistence is to use all 9. Yes, ma'am.
For the animal parts that we use to contain,
Yes.
can you use them until they wear out?
Can you use the sheaths, for instance, until they wear out?
Or the skulls, or?
My opinion would be no. And if you take the stag bladder and it's been buried in the earth for a year, there's not going to be much of that bladder left. It will melt into the yarrow. You can find fragments of the bladder membrane. If you find the whole bladder and you think you could reuse it, then you didn't make a very good preparation in all probability. That's the bladder. Same thing for the chamomile, which is placed in bovine intestines. I think I forgot to mention that along the way. It is associated with the intestines, but we make sausages. Instead of stuffing them with the usual sausage ingredients, we have stuffed them with moistened chamomile blossoms and bury them so that they spend the winter in the earth. There's not much of the intestinal material left when you dig it up. Sometimes you can find traces of membrane, mostly not. The stinging nettle, there's no sheath to worry about. The oak bark, my sense, and this is not, this is still a minority view in biodynamics, I would say. My sense is that the actual sheath is the meninges lining within the skull. And my insistence is that you use a fresh skull. Lily Kalisko, I mentioned her Agriculture of Tomorrow. She did a lot of early research in biodynamics. She pretty much pointed to a fresh skull. She tested all kinds of skulls. But a lot of people in biodynamics take the skull from the slaughterhouse, bury it in a compost pile, dig it up. There's no meninges membrane left in the skull because the critters in the compost pile have taken care of it. Sometimes they put it up in the crotch of a tree and let whatever critters are around, flies, fly larvae, etc., get rid of the flesh that might still be on the skull. But they also get rid of the meninges lining. And when we dig up the oak bark and when we dig up the skulls and empty the oak bark from the skulls, we often have what I call brain worms. I haven't fully identified them, but they're pencil-thin earthworms, of the nature of earthworms at least, the pencil point thin. And they're at least this long, and they coil within the oak bark, and they look like brain tissue. I'm told by a friend who's got one of his scientific colleagues, I'm told that they are, it's not parasite, that they're a critter that can be found only in living brain tissue. Now, we haven't purely identified that, but the fact that I can find them in the oak bark when I dig the skull up, and they're only found in living brain tissue, tells me that somehow that oak bark has transformed to something alive that can harbor this particular earthworm. Fascinating. When I talk to other prep makers, there's only one other person who says they might have seen such critters in their oak bark, but nobody else has, so something's going on. Yes, sir.
Can you give us an overall picture of, if we had all the preparations available to us, what would be the regimen through the year?
The initial instructions that Steiner seemed to give, that the early practitioners, was that first you make compost, then you apply that to the soil, then you apply your 500. When you've got plants growing it, then you apply your 501, your silica. So that's the orthodox approach. If you have a fungus problem in your growing season, then you worry about equisetum. I would say maybe the best thing to do is to do a sequential spray. Probably, if you're first addressing soil, pick a root period and apply all the preparations in a sequence. 500 BC 500, or my recommendation now is 500 XP, 501, 500 XP again, 508, or you can reverse. In root, probably root is a cold and dry element. The four elements, I'm sorry: fire, earth, air, water. Fruit, root, flower, leaf. Fire, earth, air, water. Characteristics: fire is hot. It's also dry. Root is cold and dry. Air or flower is moist and hot. Water, leaf, is cold and wet. So you have two wet ones, flower and leaf, that the watery forces will be more present, and you have two dry, fruit and earth. But we want to address the soil to begin with, so I would do a sequence in earth.
How soon would you repeat that?
Well, if you really are ambitious, you could think about repeating it 3 or 4 days later when it's in a different constellation, when the moon is in a different constellation. And ideally, this is overkill, you might say, or too much biodynamics for some people. Ideally, the first season you would pick fire, earth, air, water constellations in some, and do a sequence in each one of those over a period of 2-3 months. The more you treat your soils with the preparations, the faster will your soils come alive.